Utah is known for its red rocks, quiet towns, and clean-cut secrets. But buried in that silence are people who walked out of frame and never came back. Some vanished in daylight, others into thin air. No suspects, no bodies, no endings. Just 33 stories where reality cracked and nothing made sense again. These aren't just cold cases, they're black holes. And once you fall in, you start to wonder, how many people can a place lose before someone finally starts asking the wrong questions? This is 33 Utah Missing People, Mysteries That Cannot Be Explained. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed. This channel is where the strange things live, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. While you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Milwaukee? 3 a.m. in Tokyo? Let's see how far this mystery reaches. Susan Cox Powell. It began with pancakes. The morning of the 7th of December, 2009, was the kind of winter day that forgot what it was doing. The sky over West Valley City, Utah, hung low and metallic, neither snowing nor shining, just brooding. Inside a suburban home on Sarah Circle, a batch of pancakes sat uneaten on the counter. The scent of burnt batter lingered in the air like a question that refused to leave the room. Susan Powell had made them. Probably. Maybe. No one could quite remember who cooked that day. But the pancakes were there, and Susan wasn't. When police entered the Powell home later that day, they found 2 box fans blowing on a wet spot on the carpet. A couch cushion was missing, her purse, wallet, keys, all still there. Her cell phone had been tucked inside the family minivan, as if it had been grounded. Her husband, Josh Powell, claimed he had taken their 2 young sons on a spontaneous camping trip to Simpson Springs in the middle of the night in a snowstorm. Without telling anyone, with 2 toddlers, he said he thought it was a good time to make s'mores. It wasn't. By the time he returned, Susan was gone. And so was the life they had carefully constructed, or rather, the illusion of one. The investigation didn't take long to point in one direction. Josh. His stories didn't line up. His behavior grew erratic. He refused a polygraph. He lawyered up, packed up, moved to Washington with his kids, and started giving interviews that made his own parents squirm. But he wasn't arrested. There was no body, no blood, no crime scene, just a wet patch on a beige carpet, a broken family photo, and a woman who had vanished into the great American mythos of suburban dread. The kind of story that makes you check the locks, even when you're already inside the house. Susan had left behind a journal, a will of sorts, and a growing collection of digital breadcrumbs. Emails to friends, warnings to coworkers, whispers of a life that looked safe from the outside but crackled with fear behind the curtains. She told people she thought her husband might hurt her, might do something drastic. She even said, "If I die, it may not be an accident." She died anyway. Probably, maybe. No one can quite agree what happened next. Josh, meanwhile, took to the media circuit like a man trying to edit his own Wikipedia page. He offered alternative timelines, accused Susan of running away with another man, hinted that she had a secret life. He even suggested she had left willingly to escape her Mormon upbringing, an ironic twist given that he had renounced his own faith long before their marriage soured. But behind the scenes, things were unraveling. Investigators uncovered disturbing images on his computer, not illegal, but deeply unsettling. His father, Stephen Powell, was arrested for voyeurism after they found thousands of voyeuristic photographs he had taken of young women, including Susan. The story, already twisted, started to loop back on itself in stranger and darker ways. A family feeding on itself. Then came the 5th of February, 2012. Josh, under increasing scrutiny and with his children under supervised custody, set up a visitation at his rented home. When the boys arrived, he pulled them inside and slammed the door shut. The social worker banged on the door. Called 911. She smelled gas. It was already too late. The house exploded. Josh and the two boys were gone. The flames took with them any answers they might have given, any confessions that might have clawed their way out. He didn't leave a note. He didn't owe anyone the truth. And Susan? Still missing. Still listed as an open case. No remains, no confirmation, just silence. An open grave that has yet to be dug. Some say her body is hidden in an abandoned mine shaft. Others whisper about the desert, the snow, the cold places where secrets are stored. Cadaver dogs once hit on a spot at Topaz Mountain, but the earth kept its mouth shut. Over the years, Susan's face became one of those haunting reminders of how a person can vanish so completely, even when everything about their life seems catalogued and recorded. She was a wife, a mother, a devout believer, a woman with plans and Pinterest boards, and yet all of that was no match for the black hole of domestic erasure. She is Utah's most famous missing woman, a ghost that clings to every true crime podcast intro, every amateur sleuth's message board, every church bulletin still taped to community center windows. Her story became legend more for what it never revealed than what it did. But in Utah, legends don't die. They migrate. Because not even a month after Susan's face stopped dominating the front page, another woman in Salt Lake City disappeared on her way home from work. Just like that. Gone. Her name was Cherie Warren. And like Susan, she didn't leave a note. Cherie Sorensen Warren. At 5:30 p.m. on the 2nd of October, 1985, Cherie Warren clocked out of work at the Utah State Employees Credit Union in downtown Salt Lake City. It was a regular Wednesday, unremarkable in every visible way. She was 25, recently divorced, and had plans to meet her estranged husband later that evening to hand off their 3-year-old son. She told her coworkers she'd see them tomorrow. She never did. Cherie walked out into the dry October dusk, the kind of fall light that looks gold but feels cold. The city hummed as it always did, buses sighing at red lights, people shuffling with jackets half-zipped, everyone already halfway to their next obligation. Cherie, dressed in business attire, made her way to the parking lot. From that moment on, the details begin to evaporate. No one saw her get into her car. No one saw her leave. In fact, no one saw her again at all. 3 weeks later, her bronze 1984 Toyota Corolla surfaced in Las Vegas. Neatly parked. No signs of damage or struggle. The keys were gone. Her ID was gone. And Cherie, still missing. Vegas, of course, changed the tone. Suddenly, the case wasn't just a local tragedy. It became a riddle with neon lights and too many possible answers. The detectives had questions, but Vegas doesn't hand out clarity, only distractions. Was she abducted? Did she run? Did someone she know drive the car there to mislead investigators? That question still sits like a coffee ring on every report written since. The first suspect was the most obvious. Charles Warren, her ex-husband, the man she was supposed to meet that night. He said she never showed, claimed he had nothing to do with it. No concrete evidence ever tied him to her disappearance, and he remained at a curious distance, close enough to be implicated, distant enough to avoid arrest. He was questioned, yes, but not charged. Then there was another man in Cherie's life, a newer boyfriend, one with a complicated past and more than a few red flags. Law enforcement would later note that this man had a history with violence, particularly against women. He had also worked with Cherie, and he had been fired shortly before she vanished. He, too, denied involvement, and like so many cold cases with multiple possibilities, suspicion never solidified into justice. But perhaps the strangest part of Cherie Warren's case wasn't who she knew it was what the police didn't know. Despite the public interest, and despite her sudden and complete disappearance, her case file remained locked away for decades. A sealed vault of unanswered questions, vague police notes, and dead-end interviews. It wasn't until journalists and podcasters began digging in the 2010 second, most notably through investigative series like Cold, that the details began to breathe again. But by then, the trail was colder than the Wasatch wind. You'd think, in the digital age, that stories like Cherie's would resolve eventually, that someone, somewhere, would come forward. But what technology gives in reach, it takes away in permanence. Files get lost, people move, memories rot like apples on the shelf. Over time, names like Cherie's become less a cry for help and more a quiet sigh, a resigned ghost in the background noise of daily life. Still, certain details keep haunting. For instance, how does a car get from Salt Lake to Las Vegas with no trace of its driver? Why was the car parked as if someone wanted it to be found, but not too soon? And why, all these years later, does every plausible theory feel equally implausible? Theories abound, of course. She was lured away under false pretenses. She was killed, and the body hidden in one of the countless canyons that carve the Utah wilderness into secrets. She ran perhaps to escape a life she no longer recognized, perhaps to disappear on her own terms. But none of these theories explain the central contradiction of Cherie Warren's case. She had no reason to vanish. And yet, she did. She left behind a child, a job, a family who loved her, and a life that, while complicated, was not collapsing. There were no signs of crisis, no cryptic goodbye, no dramatic finale. Just the hum of city lights, the dusk of a Wednesday evening, and a woman who said she'd be right back. She never was. Her son grew up without answers. Her parents died still hoping. And every few years, when a tip resurfaces or an article is written, her photo circulates again. A soft smile frozen in 1985, paired with a caption that never changes, missing. Last seen near downtown Salt Lake City. The saddest part? Her story was never even front-page material. Not really. Not in the way other cases were. The media moved on quickly. So did the public. But somewhere, under layers of redacted reports and unspoken truths, the truth about what happened to Cherie Warren still sits, stubborn and silent. But silence doesn't always mean the end. Sometimes it just waits its turn. Because just 2 months after Cherie vanished, another woman went missing in the very same part of Utah. She wasn't a stranger to the system. She wasn't even considered a mystery at first. Her name was Joyce Yost. And her case, unlike Cherie's, had a suspect from day one, but it still couldn't be solved. If you're still with us, 2 stories deep into Utah's long list of vanishing points, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. There are 31 more to go, and each one gets stranger. Also, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? We want to know who else is wide awake asking the same uncomfortable questions. Joyce Yost. Joyce Yost was the kind of person who left an impression not in a loud or dramatic way, but in the quiet, magnetic way people remember without realizing it. She had a warm smile, the kind you'd trust to help you pick out paint colors or watch your dog while you were away. She lived in South Ogden, Utah, and she was 39 years old when she vanished in the summer of 1985. The 10th of August, to be exact. The night the trail went cold. She had plans that evening, like most people do when they don't know they're about to become a headline. She was last seen near her apartment complex. She'd told people where she was going. She didn't seem anxious or afraid. She was the kind of woman who took care of herself, independent, self-reliant, and quick to smile when someone needed reassurance. So when she disappeared, it didn't make sense. Not at first, not to anyone who knew her, not to her daughter Kim, who was expecting to see her mother the next morning and instead found only silence. The case quickly took a different shape than most disappearances, because this time there was a suspect almost immediately. His name was Douglas Lovell, and Joyce had already reported him to the police months earlier. Their paths had crossed in a way that left her scared enough to testify in court. She'd done the hard thing. She'd stood up, she'd said his name out loud, and he knew it. She was scheduled to appear as a witness against him. Then she vanished. Law enforcement connected the dots almost instantly, but even with suspicion circling Lovell like a hawk, they couldn't find Joyce. No body, no direct evidence. Only context, and context, as it turns out, doesn't make for easy convictions. Still, they pursued it. Detectives believed Joyce had been silenced to prevent her testimony, but proving that theory in court required more than intuition. It required something the case never gave up: physical proof. The result? A limbo case. Everyone knew who they suspected, but no one could do anything about it. Years passed. Joyce's name drifted into that strange middle ground where the public forgets but the family never does. The kind of unresolved story that haunts the holidays, lingers on birthdays, and turns family photos into altars. Then, in a turn that would be poetic if it weren't so cruel, Lovell eventually confessed. Not publicly, not in front of a judge, but in private, first to a church bishop, then again to investigators. He admitted to killing her, described how he'd done it, why he did it, and what he thought it would solve. But there was a problem. He said he couldn't remember where her body was, claimed the landscape had changed, couldn't recall the precise place he had left her. And just like that, Joyce's story became a paradox. A murder case with a confession, but no closure. Even with his statements, the remains were never recovered. He was eventually convicted and sentenced to death, not just because of what he did, but because of how clearly he tried to erase her. The system caught up to him, but not in time to bring her home. And Joyce? She remains officially missing. Not found, not buried, not returned. Just gone. In that bitter way that leaves everything incomplete. Her daughter, Kim, spent decades navigating the liminal space between knowing and not knowing. She became an advocate, a voice, and, in many ways, the last vessel of her mother's story. Without a grave to visit, she turned her life into a kind of living memorial, one that refused to let her mother become just another unsolved line in a spreadsheet. The story of Joyce Yost is chilling not just because of what happened, but because of what almost didn't. If the case had moved a little slower, if the justice system had been a little less stubborn, Lovell might never have faced consequences. His confession, delayed by years, was voluntary, at least in part. But that's not justice. It's the illusion of it. A half-built bridge over a canyon no one knows how to cross. The public rarely remembers the details of these cases, but they remember the feeling they leave behind. Joyce's story isn't just one of loss. It's a study in how systems can fail even when they're technically functioning. Everyone did what they were supposed to. The police investigated. The prosecutors prepared. Joyce spoke up. But none of it stopped the ending from arriving anyway. The cruel irony is that Joyce's bravery became the very thing that made her a target. Her willingness to testify, to name what others are afraid to name, became the fuse that lit her disappearance. That tension, that moral knot, is what keeps this case from settling into the dust. And despite everything we now know, she's still missing. Her body never found. Her name etched not into stone, but into records, interviews, and the vague ache of unresolved justice. She is, like so many women in the margins of Utah's history, both known and unknowable. And she was not the first. Because 10 years earlier, on the 4th of July, 1975, a young woman named Nancy Baird walked out of her job at a gas station in East Layton and vanished just as completely. Nancy Baird. The thing about the 4th of July is that it promises noise, fireworks, parades, backyard arguments about hot dogs. But in East Layton, Utah, on the 4th of July, 1,975. The silence was louder than anything exploding in the sky. Nancy Baird was 23 years old when she vanished. That day she was working a shift at the Fina gas station off Highway 89, a job that was neither glamorous nor dramatic, which is probably how she liked it. She had a young son at home, a steady routine, and no reason to expect the day would end in anything other than a paycheck and maybe a sparkler or two. But around midday, she simply disappeared from her post. Her car was there. Her purse was there. Her lunch, uneaten, sat behind the counter. One customer reported seeing her just before noon. By 12:30, someone else pulled up and found the gas station unattended. There were no screams, no alarms, just a station that had, for some reason, been abandoned mid-shift. It didn't take long for people to worry. Nancy wasn't the kind of person who flaked or wandered off. She had a child, she had responsibilities, and she had made plans for the evening. By the time the fireworks were lighting up the sky that night, search efforts were already underway. But nothing was found. No signs of a struggle, no witnesses, no trace. Police scoured the area. They interviewed friends, family, co-workers. They pulled highway surveillance and checked local hospitals. Nothing. The station's cash register wasn't touched. Her car hadn't moved, and her body then and now has never been found. Nancy Baird became one of the earliest cold cases in a state that would go on to collect them like ghosts in a cabinet. And yet, her story might have stayed just another haunting footnote in local law enforcement records had it not been for what came after. Over the following years, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Young women, often with light hair, often petite, often vanishing from public places in broad daylight, were going missing along the I-15 corridor. Some were waitresses, some students, some mothers like Nancy, different cities, similar stories. And then, like a shadow stretching backward through time, the name Ted Bundy entered the narrative. Bundy, who would later be linked to a series of horrific murders across the western United States, had been active in Utah around the same time Nancy disappeared. In fact, he had been attending law school at the University of Utah in 1975. He was later connected to multiple disappearances in the area. The timing, the victim profile, the proximity, it was enough to draw suspicion. But that's all it ever was. Suspicion. Nancy's case was never officially tied to Bundy. Despite speculation, despite patterns, despite what we now know about how easily he moved between cities and identities, there was no evidence, just a lingering possibility. The kind that doesn't solve anything but refuses to be ignored. Nancy's family, understandably, spent decades trapped in that uncomfortable middle space. Too many details to accept randomness, too few to know anything for sure. Every new lead was a maybe. Every rumor, a reminder that closure might never come. Her son grew up with stories instead of memories. And East Layton, once a small and quiet place where people knew each other's pets by name, became the kind of town where people locked their doors a little earlier, watched the road a little more carefully. The passage of time did what it always does. It dulled the headlines. Police moved on to other cases. But for the handful of people who still carried Nancy's memory, nothing really moved forward. The problem with a clean disappearance is that it ages badly. There's no evidence to retest, no remains to re-examine, no crime scene to revisit, just theories. And Nancy Baird's case has had more than a few. Some believe she was taken by someone she knew. Others point to long-haul truckers who passed through the area. There are even those who suggest she might have left voluntarily, though that theory has always felt less like a possibility and more like a coping mechanism for a public that doesn't like loose ends. And yet, the loose end remains. What makes Nancy's story so unsettling isn't just how little we know, but how quickly she was forgotten by the public. Within days, the media cycle moved on. Within weeks, new faces filled the newspapers. Her name became a line item in the files of the Utah Department of Public Safety, reduced to a grainy black and white photo and a few dates typed in courier font. But disappearances like hers don't really vanish. They calcify. They become part of the state's psychic architecture, a slow, ambient anxiety that sits just under the surface. A reminder that even a well-lit gas station at noon on a national holiday can be a portal to nowhere. And just when Utah might have started to forget the name Nancy Baird, another name began echoing down the canyons of southern Utah nearly 40 years later. A teenage boy this time. His name was Mackin Smith. And like Nancy, he left behind everything except an explanation. Mackin Smith. It's the details that make it feel staged, or cursed, or both. On the morning of the 1st of September, 2015, in the desert city of Street, George, Utah, a place more known for its red rock cliffs and retirement golf carts than true crime headlines. One 7-year-old Mackin Smith got up, got ready for school, left his house, and never showed up to class. That much is fact. His parents, Darren and Tracy Smith, assumed he'd gone to school as usual. He'd packed his backpack. He walked out the door at 7:30 a.m., just like always. There were no signs of distress, no shouting matches, no slamming of doors, no calls home from the school, at least not immediately. It wasn't until later that day, when Tracy checked in, that something felt off. The school hadn't seen Mackin, and no one else had either. It wasn't a dramatic vanishing. It was a teenage boy who left the house like he'd be back for dinner. But the hours passed. The house remained silent. And the realization settled in. Mackin hadn't gone to school. He hadn't gone anywhere he was supposed to. And most chillingly, he hadn't taken anything with him. His cell phone was left behind. So was his wallet. No clothes missing. No money withdrawn. No known friends who had seen him that day. Just a backpack, and even that, police say, might have been empty. For a boy of 17-inch 2015 to vanish without a phone is its own kind of paradox. A teenager in this era isn't just plugged in, they're wired into the ecosystem. Text threads, Instagram likes, GPS pings, TikTok scrolls, digital exhaust in all directions. But Mackin left no digital trail. He stepped out of his family home and into a void. Which is why the case got strange fast. The Smiths were a deeply structured family. LDS, organized, respectful of rules and routines. Mackin had recently returned from a semester living with his older brother in Canada. According to family accounts, he had struggled socially, felt isolated at school, was trying to find his footing. He wrote poetry. He was quiet, intelligent, thoughtful. At times, withdrawn. Like many teens, he was navigating the strange fog between childhood and adulthood, between expectation and identity. But none of that, his family insists, pointed to this. The police were called, canvasses were conducted, K-9 units searched nearby fields, flyers were posted all over town. The internet lit up with speculation, concern, and the usual Reddit-fueled amateur sleuthing. His parents made emotional pleas to the public. His siblings mobilized friends and volunteers. Search teams combed through crevices in the desert, drainage tunnels, the foothills on the edge of town, drones, helicopters. Nothing. Nothing. And then came the notes. About a week into the search, Mackin's parents found something tucked under his bedroom laptop. A pair of handwritten notes, one addressed to them, the other still undisclosed to the public. The contents of those notes have never been fully revealed, but they changed the tone of the investigation. What had started as a missing person case shifted into something murkier. Not criminal, necessarily, but not random, either. Still, law enforcement has never declared the case closed. They've never found physical evidence that Mackin did something final, nor did they find anything to support foul play. No witnesses, no footage. No trace. There were reported sightings, gas stations, bus stops, homeless shelters. Tips came in from Vegas, California, even Canada, but none of them panned out. Each new lead evaporated under scrutiny. Some people believe Masson ran away, that he decided to start over, to unplug from his life and disappear by choice. They point to his writings, his withdrawn demeanor, his sense of not quite fitting into the mold. That theory brings a strange kind of hope, the idea that he might still be out there, building a quiet life, watching from the sidelines. Others believe he met with tragedy in the unforgiving desert terrain near his home, that he wandered into the wilderness to clear his head or to make some private decision and never came back, that he got lost, that he didn't plan to vanish, he just did. And then there are those who think something more sinister happened, that someone picked him up, that someone knew more than they said, that the clues were too clean, too perfect, too curated to be natural. Even now, Masson's disappearance fractures everyone who studies it. It's a puzzle where none of the pieces lock, a story that feels like it should have a middle and an end but doesn't. His family, to their credit, has remained publicly active. They organized search efforts, launched awareness campaigns, gave interviews, and kept his name alive in Utah media long after most cases would have gone quiet. But behind those efforts is something harder to reconcile: doubt. Not the kind that accuses, the kind that aches. Because when someone vanishes without a trace, without a signal, without a footprint, the most haunting question isn't what happened, it's how. How does a modern teenager disappear in broad daylight without anyone seeing? That's the question that haunted Street George in 2015. And it's the same one that echoed through Salt Lake City half a century earlier, when another teenager, this time walking his dogs, slipped just as quietly into the unknown. His name was Reed Jepson, and he never came back either. Reed Taylor Jepson. It was a Sunday afternoon in October, the kind that lingers just long enough to feel borrowed from summer. On the 24th of October, 1964, 15-year-old Reed Taylor Jepson finished lunch at his family home in Salt Lake City, changed his clothes, and walked out the door with his two dogs, German short-haired pointers named Bobo and Punch. He never returned. Neither did the dogs. No drama, no witnesses, no commotion. Just a quiet, clean disappearance in broad daylight, half a mile from home. Reed was a sophomore at East High School, a football player, a good student, clean-cut, friendly, polite. He was the second of 6 children in a Latter-day Saint family. He delivered newspapers in the mornings and worked as a dog trainer in his spare time, the kind of kid people remembered for showing up on time and saying thank you, the kind of kid who doesn't just vanish. And yet, he did. The last confirmed sighting of Reed came from a friend who saw him walking near the college campus of the University of Utah, not far from the Mount Olivet Cemetery. The friend said they spoke briefly, nothing out of the ordinary. Reed said he was taking the dogs for a quick walk and would be back soon. That was the last time anyone saw him. No one reported hearing a struggle. No reports of a vehicle. No footprints. No witnesses. No dropped items. The dogs were trained and obedient. Reed was responsible. He had plans that day. He had football practice the next morning. He had a life, and then he didn't. The police were called quickly. The Jepson family acted immediately. They scoured the neighborhood, the foothills, the canyons, the parks. Flyers were distributed. Dogs were tracked. Psychics were even consulted. Nothing turned up. The dogs, people assumed, would have returned on their own. Dogs come back. They find their way. But Bobo and Punch never did. And that detail, the missing dogs, has lingered in the background of Reed's case like a static hum, because it complicates things. If Reed had simply run away, why take both dogs? And if he'd met with an accident, wouldn't at least one of the dogs have come back? Someone would have seen them. But they, too, were swallowed by the silence. In the years that followed, every possibility was raised and then slowly dismissed. An accident? Maybe. But where? His body was never found. A kidnapping? There were no witnesses, no vehicle descriptions, foul play, no signs of struggle, no motive, no evidence. He didn't take money, or clothes, or supplies. He left behind everything except for 2 dogs and a stretch of sidewalk. Decades passed. The Jepson family waited, hoped, grieved. But time has a way of turning hope into habit. Reed's mother kept his room the same for years. His siblings grew up, started families, and carried the question with them into adulthood. What happened to Reed? It became one of Salt Lake City's longest-running mysteries. In official terms, Reed is still listed as a missing person. Not a runaway, not deceased. Missing, technically open, perpetually unresolved. What makes Reed's story so haunting isn't just the lack of evidence, it's how quickly it all slipped away. There was no warning, no build-up, no aftermath. One moment he was walking his dogs, the next he was gone. No trail, no sightings, no remains, just the open wound of a family left behind. Some have speculated over the years that Reed may have fallen into an abandoned mine shaft or gotten lost in the foothills, but those theories don't quite fit. He knew the area well. He wasn't far from home. And again, what about the dogs? Others have floated darker theories: abduction, perhaps by someone familiar to him. Someone who knew the dogs well enough to control them, knew Reed's routine, and had the opportunity to intercept him in the narrow window of his walk. But even that feels like a stretch with no solid evidence. There was no ransom, no confession, no clues, just the kind of silence that grows deeper with every year that passes. In 2010, more than 4 decades after Reed disappeared, the Salt Lake City Police Department reopened the case and began reviewing the limited evidence. They consulted cold case experts, examined old interviews, and tried once again to follow the invisible threads. But the results were the same: inconclusive. Even the ground, when searched, refused to give up any secrets. The tragedy of Reed Jepson is not just that he disappeared, but that he disappeared so completely. A 15-year-old boy walking his dogs in a familiar neighborhood shouldn't just vanish. Not then, not now, not ever. And yet, that's exactly what happened. His name still appears on missing person databases. His story still echoes through Salt Lake news articles every few years. His face, frozen in the style of the 1,962nd clean hairline, soft eyes, a gentle smirk, remains posted on the wall of cold case investigators as a kind of challenge no one has yet solved. His family still remembers. So do a handful of old-timers in Salt Lake. But the city itself has moved on, like cities do. New buildings, new distractions, new headlines. But the sidewalk where Reed walked remains. The streets haven't changed that much. Not really. And on certain autumn afternoons, when the light hits the pavement just right, you can still imagine him there. Just a boy, 2 dogs, and a promise to be right back. But in Utah, those are the promises that never hold. Just ask the parents of Debbie Frost, the teenager who left a concert in Salt Lake City one summer night in 1984 and never made it home. Debbie Lorraine Frost. Salt Lake City, in the summer of 1984, had a peculiar kind of optimism. The economy was stable, the air tasted like sun-warmed asphalt, and teenagers wandered downtown without checking in every 15 minutes. You could lose hours in the arcade, sneak into a movie theater, or wander Temple Square with headphones on and the world tuned out. It was that in-between era, past the age of milk cartons, but before the world decided to be afraid of everything. Debbie Frost was 17 years old when she disappeared, not much older than Reed Jepson had been 2 decades earlier, but the city she vanished into was a very different place. On the night of the 9th of July, 1984. Debbie was seen near the downtown concert area, what would now be the Gallivan Center, or somewhere close. She was petite, brown-haired, wore jeans and a tank top, and like most teenagers that night, she blended into the scene. She wasn't reported missing immediately, just thought to be out late, maybe staying with a friend. But the next day came, then the next, and Debbie didn't come home. She had no car, no credit card, no access to large sums of money, and perhaps most importantly, no reason to vanish. She was close with her family, especially her mother. She wasn't in any kind of legal trouble. She didn't have a known history of running away. Her grades were decent, her relationships normal. Her life, by most accounts, was uneventful in the way that stable lives are, but on that summer night, something broke the pattern. What little is known comes from the early police investigation notes that feel more like questions than facts. Debbie was seen talking to someone near the concert grounds. Not unusual. No one recalled shouting or tension, just casual interaction. Some witnesses said she might have been heading toward Main Street. Others thought they saw her near a convenience store around 10:30 p.m. But all of that remains foggy eyewitness accounts taken after the fact, under streetlights and uncertainty. And then, she was gone. Police treated it as a possible runaway at first. Not uncommon. Teenagers disappear. Some for hours, some for days, and many, eventually, come back. Debbie didn't. There was no note, no backpack left behind, no goodbye message to a friend. Her room was untouched, her clothes still hanging, her life intact except for her. Her mother reported her missing promptly, but like many cases in that era, urgency was slow to arrive. By the time detectives began to take it seriously, the trail had already cooled. Tips came in, sightings that never checked out, theories that led nowhere, false confessions from people who wanted to be part of something tragic. Nothing stuck. In the years since, the case has remained open but stagnant. No suspects, no remains, no new evidence, just the same questions on repeat. What could have happened in the heart of downtown Salt Lake City on a warm, populated evening to a teenage girl who left no trace? It's the kind of question that fractures every theory. If someone took her, how did they manage it without a sound? If she left with someone voluntarily, why has she never contacted anyone again? If she encountered danger, an accident, a fall, a misstep, why has her body never been found? The downtown area was already developed in 1984, but not like it is now. There were open lots, under construction buildings, hidden corners. Still, it wasn't wilderness. It was a city center, and the idea that someone could vanish so entirely in that kind of environment defies logic. Some have speculated about serial offenders operating in the region at the time. Salt Lake City had its share of dark figures in the shadows during the late 72nd and early 82nd men, who drifted from city to city under aliases, whose timelines remain unverified. But nothing has ever conclusively linked Debbie's disappearance to any known offender. There's also the possibility that she simply trusted the wrong person, a classmate, an older friend, someone who offered her a ride home, someone who seemed safe until they weren't. But all of that is guesswork. In truth, the most disturbing part of Debbie Frost's disappearance is how ordinary the setting was. This wasn't a lonely trail or a remote gas station. This was downtown, surrounded by lights, people, noise, a city full of eyes, and still, no one saw anything. Over the years, her mother continued to hope, to push, to make phone calls and attend public meetings, and pin faded photos to corkboards in case anyone might remember something new. But time does what it always does. It wears things down. Her mother eventually passed, never knowing. Today, Debbie Frost's case lives quietly on public records. Her photo, a blurry snapshot of a girl with tired eyes and half a smile, still surfaces in online forums and cold case databases. Occasionally, her name is spoken on podcasts or by amateur sleuths revisiting the city's unsolved cases. But mostly, she's a question mark. A girl who went to a concert and never came back. And Salt Lake, once again, shrugged, moved on, reinvented itself. But somewhere under its concrete bones is a memory of that night. And if cities remember things the way people do, quietly, painfully, and only in flashes, then Salt Lake must still carry a trace of her in the streets. Because just 20 years later, another man would vanish from the very same city. Not a teenager, not a runaway. A grown man with a child on the way. His name was Jeffrey Nichols. And like Debbie, he left behind nothing but a question. 7 disappearances in. And if your brain's already spiraling, you're not alone. These stories don't get easier, they get weirder. So, if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. And while the silence settles, tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it? Because something tells us you're not watching this in broad daylight. Jeffrey Nichols. The 8th of June, 2004, was a Tuesday in Salt Lake City, the kind of day nobody remembers on purpose. Not a holiday, not a weekend, just a regular weekday with morning commuters, half-drunk coffee cups, and the humming noise of people going about lives they assumed would still be intact by evening. Jeffrey Nichols was 31 years old, tall, quiet, thoughtful, the kind of man who wore responsibility like a jacket he never took off. He worked at an insurance company, had friends, a social circle, a routine. His girlfriend was pregnant with their child. He had things to look forward to, things to plan. Things to be afraid of, but only the usual ones. That morning, Jeffrey left his apartment in the Avenues neighborhood of Salt Lake. He got into his silver Dodge Stratus and was never seen again. It wasn't until later that afternoon that concern began to grow. He didn't return any phone calls, didn't show up where he was supposed to. His girlfriend, who was about 7 months pregnant at the time, tried to reach him. Nothing. Hours passed, and the silence got heavier. The next day, police found his car abandoned near the Jordan River Parkway Trail, close to 5600 South. The car was locked, no signs of damage, no indications of a struggle. His keys were missing. His wallet, gone. But inside the vehicle were some personal belongings, things he wouldn't have left behind if he were simply running an errand or going for a walk. Jeffrey, however, was nowhere in sight. The Jordan River area, while scenic and often peaceful, has a kind of hollow quality to it. It's not wilderness exactly, but it has wild edges. Trails that drift off into pockets of overgrowth, water that moves slow and forgets what it's carrying, underpasses that echo in strange ways. It's a place that can swallow things, if not literally, then atmospherically. Search parties combed the area. K-9 units, police helicopters, volunteer teams. The river was dragged, fields and embankments were examined. Nothing turned up, no clothes, no phone, no footprints, no evidence. Just silence, again. Theories emerged like weeds. Maybe Jeffrey had chosen to disappear. Maybe he walked away to start a new life. The kind of tired narrative that people default to when logic fails. But those who knew him, really knew him, never bought it. His girlfriend was weeks from giving birth. He was excited, nervous, but ready. He'd made plans. Had financial responsibilities he never would have ditched, and no indication that he was spiraling or under pressure. This wasn't a man preparing an exit. It was a man preparing for fatherhood. The police investigated the usual angles: financial records, phone logs, possible conflicts at work. They looked into associates, ex-girlfriends, anyone who might have had a reason to wish him harm or distract him from his path. But there was nothing, not even a rumor with legs. The river was the most obvious suspect. The idea that he may have fallen in, gotten caught on something, been swept away. But that theory always felt like a stand-in, something people say when they run out of better stories. The Jordan River isn't known for strong currents or hidden whirlpools. It's shallow in most places. Unforgiving in smell, yes, but not in depth. If Jeffrey had drowned, they would have found him. So why didn't they? The only clues left behind were circumstantial. A locked car, a man with no history of instability, a pregnant girlfriend whose world collapsed quietly while the news cycle barely blinked. His name made it into the papers, yes, but briefly. A few days, a few segments, then the spotlight moved on to the next fire. Years passed. The child he never got to meet was born. Grew up, probably carries pieces of him in the shape of a smile or the sound of a laugh, but never a memory. Just the hollow echo of a name that shows up in police reports and missing person databases. Jeffrey Nichols became another Utah anomaly, another line in the growing catalog of those who stepped out the door and fell through some invisible crack in reality. His case is still open, still technically active, but not one new clue has emerged since that Tuesday in 2004, which leaves only questions. Did someone lure him to that trail intentionally? Was he meeting someone he trusted? Was it a robbery gone sideways? A wrong place, wrong time scenario that got wiped clean before it left a trace? Or was it something quieter? A disappearance so subtle and meticulously executed that it left behind nothing but air. We don't know. And that's the problem with this kind of mystery. The longer it stretches, the more it mutates. What begins as a search becomes a ritual, a shrine of maybes. A geography of grief built on places that now feel cursed. But Salt Lake never stops moving. Cars pass the spot where Jeffrey's car was found every day. Hikers walk those trails. Couples jog past riverbends that swallowed a man and gave nothing back. They don't know they're walking over a story with no ending. Just like they don't know that barely 2 years before Jeffrey vanished, another woman, Aletha Jo Williams, had walked into the heart of Salt Lake and disappeared just as cleanly, just as suddenly, and just as permanently. Aletha Jo Williams. On the morning of the 6th of March, 2002, Aletha Jo Williams was seen walking near the intersection of 1700 South and West Temple in Salt Lake City. She was 27 years old, 6 months pregnant, and by all accounts, moving slowly, not just because of the pregnancy, but because life had not been kind to her. That corner, like much of that stretch of West Temple, wasn't a place people lingered without reason. You passed through, you didn't stay long. But that morning, Aletha was seen there, and then nowhere else. She has never been seen again. Aletha's story doesn't come wrapped in polished edges. It doesn't follow the template of the perfect victim, the ones with neat resumes and framed diplomas on the news. She'd faced housing instability. She'd struggled with addiction. She floated in and out of shelters. She was known to local service providers, sometimes lived on the edge of the city's notice, sometimes just inside it. But she was also a daughter, a sister, a woman expecting a child, a human being, in every definition of the word. And she vanished in broad daylight on a weekday morning within walking distance of downtown Salt Lake City. The last person to reportedly see Aletha was a friend who said she was walking toward a known encampment area, possibly planning to visit someone she trusted. She had mentioned needing a ride later. She had plans. Nothing extravagant, just basic, next step human things. That's what makes her disappearance so disorienting. There was no suggestion that she was in crisis that day. No known conflict. No suggestion she was intending to leave or withdraw. No trail to follow, not even a thread. When Aletha was reported missing, there was no media frenzy, no public campaign, no televised interviews with family. The city barely blinked. Her name was filed under adult missing, the kind of case that often drifts into limbo within days. She was vulnerable, yes, but also invisible. And in Salt Lake, invisibility is a risk factor no one talks about. There are no clear suspects, no camera footage, no public leads. Her face appeared on a few flyers. The police opened a file, but the investigation never gained momentum, at least not publicly. She didn't get a task force. She didn't get a search grid. She didn't even get a confirmed timeline beyond that one morning on West Temple. Her unborn child was 6 months along. That's the part many people miss when they talk about Aletha. She didn't vanish alone. She vanished with a future that had a name waiting for it. A baby shower that never happened. A delivery room that stayed empty. What could have happened in the space of a few blocks on a weekday morning? Did someone pick her up? Did she meet with violence? Or collapse somewhere unseen, where no one thought to look? Could she have been taken in by someone who promised help and offered something else? Theories float like dust in cases like this, never quite landing. But this is where it gets darker. Aletha isn't the only woman to vanish from this stretch of Salt Lake City in the early 2000s. There were others, many of them with similar backgrounds. Women in transition, women without consistent shelter. Women who drifted in and out of public view like ghosts. And yet, no formal connection has ever been made. No confirmed serial pattern. No coordinated investigation tying these missing cases together. Just a quiet cluster of disappearances in a city that seems to forget people the moment they stop standing still. What sets Aletha's case apart is how much it refuses to go away despite everything. Despite the lack of leads, despite the silence, despite the city's amnesia. Every few years, her name bubbles back up in reports on missing persons, especially when conversations turn toward the systemic gaps in how we treat the vulnerable. There's no grave, no memorial, no definitive proof of death. And so, technically, Aletha remains a missing person, legally, bureaucratically, symbolically. But for her family, those who still remember her birthday, who kept the ultrasound photo, who still mark the 6th of March on the calendar, she is much more than a file. She's a wound that Salt Lake City never named out loud. And what do we make of that? How does a city that prides itself on structure and order misplace a pregnant woman in the middle of a weekday morning? We can pretend it was an accident, that someone just missed something, that the system had a bad day. But the truth is more difficult. The truth is, she was easy to overlook. Not because she wasn't important, but because she wasn't profitable. She didn't check the right boxes for headlines. She wasn't neat. And when people aren't neat, society tends to look away. But the mystery of Aletha Jo Williams doesn't just sit in the past. It bleeds forward, into the cracks of every missing persons report that doesn't get a follow-up call. Into every case where the description is more about lifestyle than identity. Into the DNA of a state that thinks things like this don't happen here. They do. And 2 decades earlier, almost to the day, another man disappeared from Salt Lake City. No background issues, no instability. He had everything in order on paper. His name was Lakhbir Singh Banwait. And he left just as cleanly. Lakhbir Singh Banwait. By 1992, Salt Lake City had entered one of its quieter decades. The winter of the Cold War had thawed. The Olympics hadn't yet arrived. Tech was still in its awkward teenage years, and the city's skyline hadn't yet decided whether it wanted to look urban or just very enthusiastic about church steeples. It was a strange in-between era, quiet but watchful. The kind of time where a man could go missing without the city even noticing. Lakhbir Singh Banwait was 27 years old, a soft-spoken man with a steady routine, a clean record, and a name that few local news anchors could pronounce with confidence. His story didn't come with controversy or preamble. He lived in Salt Lake City. He worked, paid his bills, kept his head down. The kind of man who, on paper, should never have vanished. And yet, in early May of 1992, he did. The last confirmed sighting of Lakhbir was on May 1st, a Friday. He was seen by a few acquaintances during the day, casual interactions, nothing out of the ordinary, no arguments, no erratic behavior. Just another person winding down a work week. That evening, he was expected somewhere, depending on who you ask. It was either a gathering with friends or a routine errand. He never showed. When he didn't return home that night, no alarms were sounded immediately. Lockbeer wasn't known for disappearing, but he also wasn't known for drama. People assumed he'd gotten tied up, stayed over somewhere, maybe needed space. But after a day, then two, the silence grew heavier. And then his car was found, parked, locked, and undisturbed in a quiet neighborhood in Salt Lake City, not abandoned on a highway, not tucked into a ravine, just sitting there, as if someone had borrowed it and politely returned it without the courtesy of returning the driver. Inside, nothing helpful. No wallet, no signs of a struggle, no blood, no broken glass. The kind of crime scene that wasn't really a crime scene at all, just a very still question. Police opened a missing persons case. Interviews were conducted. His home was searched. Phone records examined. But everything about Lockbeer pointed to routine. No enemies, no debts, no secret life. His family, both in Utah and abroad, insisted he wasn't the kind of man to just leave. They said he was thoughtful, respectful, reliable. The kind of person who called to confirm even small changes in plans. So why would someone like that suddenly disappear without a trace? Some investigators wondered if it was voluntary, a disappearance by choice, but that theory collapsed under its own weight. He didn't take money out of his accounts. He didn't pack a bag. He didn't buy a bus ticket, or a plane ticket, or leave behind a message for anyone. There was no digital trail, though. In fairness, it was 1,992. Digital trails weren't quite a thing yet. Another theory? He met with foul play. Maybe something random. A robbery gone wrong. A stranger with intent. Or worse, someone he knew. A betrayal that left no evidence, no aftermath. But the trouble with Lockbeer's case is the vacuum it exists in. Nothing followed. No suspicious activity on his accounts. No calls. No sightings. No second-hand stories passed around bars or shelters. Just the silence of someone who was here and then wasn't. And as time passed, the city forgot. His name never made front-page news. His case never caught the attention of prime time. There were no podcasts about him, no documentaries, just a handful of public records, a few desperate calls from his family, and a poster that eventually faded from the bulletin board in the lobby of a police station. And what do you do with that? What does it mean when a man disappears so quietly that even the theories begin to sound apologetic? There's something particularly chilling about Lockbeer's case because it lacks the usual ingredients that keep a cold case simmering. There's no drama, no enemies, no event leading up to the disappearance that feels cinematic or emotionally fraught. His life, at least publicly, was ordinary, and that's what makes his disappearance feel so utterly unexplainable. You expect unsolved cases to come with chaos, with tension, with some kind of narrative arc, but sometimes a man wakes up, goes about his day, locks his car, and then gets erased. The simplicity is unbearable. Lockbeer Singh Banwait is still officially missing. His case remains open with the Salt Lake City Police Department. Every now and then, his name appears in a roundup of long-term disappearances. A box to be checked. A line to be retyped. But there are no vigils anymore. No tips. No rumors. Just a man who stepped into the evening of May 1st, 1992, and never made it past the horizon. And in Salt Lake, those stories tend to echo. Because just 4 years later, in that very same city, another young woman would vanish again without warning, again without evidence, again without return. Her name was Vicky Lynn Smock, and her story is as quiet and as unfinished as his. Vicki Lynn Smock. By the time 1986 arrived, Salt Lake City had slipped into the winter of Reagan-era America, reassuring on the surface, unnervingly quiet underneath. It was a city still painted in soft earth tones and religious architecture, where people locked their doors more out of politeness than fear. Crime was something that happened elsewhere. Disappearances, too. Unless they didn't. Vicki Lynn Smock was 24 years old when she vanished, the 1st of January, 1986, New Year's Day. A date most people associate with hangovers, resolutions, or quiet recovery. But for Vicki, it was the last day anyone ever saw her. And what we know about her disappearance isn't just scarce, it's strangely hollow. She was last seen in Salt Lake City, but exactly where, or by whom, remains vague. The records are brief. She lived in the city, possibly with roommates, possibly alone. She was part of that transitory demographic, so common in urban centers, young, independent, working, navigating early adulthood without the safety net of family always nearby. Her daily life wasn't dramatic, but it also wasn't fully documented. She moved in and out of jobs. Her social circles shifted. There are suggestions of hardship, perhaps instability, but nothing unusual enough to raise alarms before the date in question. And then, she simply disappeared. No calls, no notes, no evidence of travel. She wasn't packing for a trip. She didn't drain her bank account. She didn't ask anyone for help, didn't announce she was leaving town, didn't even whisper intentions to close friends or coworkers. She just stopped being part of the world. Unlike some of the higher-profile cases from the same era, Vicki's disappearance didn't attract media attention. She wasn't on television. There weren't search parties combing through canyons. Her name was not passed from mouth to mouth across the state in urgent whispers. She was simply reported missing, filed away, and aside from her family and a few persistent officers, largely forgotten. The only marker of her absence became the case file. Thin, unresolved. A missing person report with no known cause, no suspects, no crime scene. The kind of case that gathers dust because it has no teeth to bite into, no obvious narrative, no trail of red flags, which makes the silence around her even more uncomfortable. Because Salt Lake, in 1986, was not as safe as it pretended to be. In fact, that period late 72nd through the 92nd was later revealed to have been a blind spot in terms of criminal tracking, especially regarding women who went missing from the margins. If you were poor, if you lived alone, if you had no children, or if your life didn't intersect with the institutions that make noise schools, churches, corporations, you could vanish without consequence. And many did. Vicki fit that dangerous demographic, independent, transient, not tethered to the kind of systems that trigger alarms when someone disappears. No employer raised a fuss, no landlord filed a complaint. No bank reported suspicious activity. Her family, likely the first to worry, pushed for answers, but the mechanisms weren't built for urgency unless the circumstances were dramatic. Vicki didn't give the city drama. She gave it absence, which the city, predictably, mishandled. Over the decades, her case remained open in name only. Occasionally, her name would surface in internal reviews, cold case re-examinations, or database upgrades. But no new information has ever emerged. There are no suspects, no promising leads, just an unresolved entry, a lost young woman, and a family whose hope aged into grief a long time ago. And here's what's most unsettling. She disappeared on New Year's Day, a day symbolic of renewal, of starting over, of setting intentions. While others were making promises to drink less soda or finally go to the gym, Vicki Smock was quietly being erased from reality. It's hard not to read that as a metaphor. Because Vicki's story doesn't just represent a personal loss, it's emblematic of a category a category of missing persons who never made it to headlines because their lives weren't easily marketable. She didn't fit the perfect victim narrative that rallies public interest. There were no graduation photos circulated on national television, no candlelight vigils covered by reporters, no dramatic developments that kept her name alive. And yet, her absence remains as real and as unjust as any case that came with a documentary deal. Some believe she may have met with foul play. Others whisper about the possibility of voluntary disappearance, though, again, there's no evidence supporting either theory. The void in her case is so total that every idea is both equally possible and equally absurd. And that's what makes the mystery of Vicky Lynn Smock quietly devastating. She existed, and then she didn't. And there's no one alive today who can explain the how, the why, or the where. All that remains is a name in a file, a blurry photo, and a date that always rings differently than it should. New Year's Day. And as the years passed, Salt Lake did what it always does. It moved on. New buildings, new parks, new people. But the streets never forget, and neither do the records, even when they grow cold. Because in June of the very year that Vicky vanished, 2 boys left for a day trip into the mountains and never came home. Their names were Michael, Lloyd, Reese, and David Jaramillo, and their mystery would double down on silence. Michael Lloyd Reese. On the morning of the 3rd of June, 1985, Michael Lloyd Reese, known to friends and family simply as Lloyd, woke up with the restless optimism of a summer day just getting started. He was 14, full of plans, and free from the obligations of school, responsibility, or structure. The calendar said Monday, but for a kid in Utah County, it might as well have said freedom. He and his friend, David Jaramillo, age 21, decided to head out for a drive. Lloyd's mother didn't think much of it. He'd gone out with David before. They were family friends, not a random pairing. The plan, as far as she knew, was to spend a few hours around East Canyon Reservoir, maybe do some fishing, maybe hang out near the water, and kill time. A typical Utah afternoon. But by nightfall, neither of them had returned. At first, there was no panic. Maybe they'd lost track of time. Maybe they'd found another ride home. Maybe they were staying with a friend and forgot to call. These were boys, after all. This was summer, and Utah, in the 82nd, still believed in the kindness of strangers. But by the next morning, things felt different. Phone calls went unanswered. Friends hadn't seen them. No one could account for where they'd gone after heading into the mountains, and that's when the search began. Police were notified. Helicopters were launched. The roads leading into East Canyon were searched and researched. Flyers went up. Tips trickled in. But the geography itself worked against the investigation. East Canyon Reservoir is surrounded by terrain that looks deceptively welcoming, rolling hills, scenic ridgelines, and narrow dirt roads that seem like they should all loop back to safety. But they don't. And in 1985, GPS was science fiction. Getting lost was much easier. So was disappearing. The first breakthrough came quickly. The car they'd left in was found, abandoned, undamaged, parked near a dirt road not far from the reservoir. The doors were locked. No signs of foul play. No blood. No broken glass. Just an empty vehicle sitting still in the middle of the mountains, like it had been placed there gently by someone who never intended to return. The search area widened. Dozens of volunteers combed the hills. Dogs were brought in. Hikers were questioned. Forest Service workers, campers, locals. Nobody had seen them. And no one could answer the most basic question. What could have happened in the middle of a beautiful June day that caused 2 people, one barely into adolescence, to disappear completely? The contrast was jarring. Lloyd was young, playful, and deeply connected to his family. David, older, but still part of the same community, wasn't the kind of person who drifted without reason. There were no signs of running away, no disputes, no criminal records. The theory that they might have vanished on purpose never made sense to those who knew them. And so, the list of possibilities shrank to the usual culprits: accident or foul play. If it was an accident, where were the remains? The gear? The clothes? Something? You don't just fall into a canyon with no trace. Even in rough terrain, nature leaves clues. If it was foul play, who would do such a thing? And why? In broad daylight, with no evidence left behind? The deeper problem was that no single theory fit. It was as if the logic of their disappearance had been erased, like someone had edited the timeline and deleted a scene. Years passed. Tips came in and dried up. One person claimed to have seen the boys hitchhiking. Another said they were at a diner. Someone else insisted they'd been picked up by a stranger in a truck. But none of those leads ever held water. None of them offered proof. Lloyd's mother kept searching long after most people would have stopped. She made phone calls, handed out flyers, followed up on every piece of second-hand information. She spoke to psychics, reporters, police. And through all of it, she clung to one belief: that whatever happened that day, her son hadn't just wandered off. She knew him too well. Michael Lloyd Reese remains missing to this day. His case, once active and urgent, has long since settled into that familiar Utah silence. A kind of respectful neglect where the file still exists, but no one opens it unless prompted. There's a photo of Lloyd that still circulates occasionally. He's smiling, shoulders slightly hunched, caught in the moment between boyhood and something older. You can see in his face the kind of kindness that makes you ache retroactively. A boy who had plans, who probably thought the biggest decision that morning would be whether to bring snacks. Instead, he became a question that's lingered for nearly 4 decades. And he wasn't alone. Because the same day Lloyd vanished, his friend David Jaramillo disappeared with him. And if Lloyd's absence feels impossible, David's feels even more unsettling. Because the moment 2 people vanish at the same time, the mystery doubles. David, Matthew, Jaramillo. If you try to follow the map backward, the 3rd of June, 1985, East Canyon Reservoir, a teenager and a young man out for a day in the Utah mountains, you quickly realize that you're not just retracing steps. You're retracing erasures. 2 lives wiped from the record in a single afternoon. One was a 4-year-old boy named Michael Lloyd Reese. The other was his 2 one-year-old friend, David Matthew Jaramillo. In many ways, David was the one expected to come home. He was the adult in the duo, the one with a driver's license, a basic sense of responsibility, the presumed foresight that comes with being 7 years older. He was supposed to be the guide, the chaperone, the protector. But whatever happened that day didn't care about age or expectations. It devoured them both. David wasn't a drifter. He wasn't unstable. He was a trusted family friend, close enough that Lloyd's parents had no reservations about him taking their son out for a day in the canyon. In fact, it wasn't unusual. The two had hung out before. Fishing trips, drives, afternoons of nothing in particular. In the mid-1982nd, that wasn't suspicious. That was normal. There was no warning sign, no last-minute phone call, no cryptic behavior. David had plans beyond that day, family commitments, loose ends to tie. He had been looking for work. He'd been staying with relatives, trying to get his life moving in the right direction. His future wasn't mapped out perfectly, but it wasn't unraveling either. And that's what makes his disappearance so difficult to fit into any known shape. The car they left in a brown Chevrolet was found later that evening near a dirt pullout in the East Canyon area. Parked neatly, no damage, locked, left behind as if the driver had every intention of returning. But no one did. David, like Lloyd, was gone. If it were only one of them, the theories might be easier to grasp. A teenager gets lost in the woods. An adult meets foul play. A single disappearance leaves some room for tragedy to disguise itself as chance. But two people, both familiar with the area, both expected back that same day, both vanishing without a trace, that doesn't just stretch credibility, it breaks it. Search teams canvass the region over and over. Police officers, volunteers, family members, search dogs, helicopters, for days, then weeks. Nothing turned up. Not a wallet, not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing. Even the dogs didn't leave a scent to follow. It's as if the canyon swallowed them whole. One theory, early on, suggested they might have taken off voluntarily, that perhaps David had decided to run and brought Lloyd with him, but that theory barely held up under scrutiny. David had no history of fleeing or instability, and Lloyd wasn't the kind of teenager who would vanish without telling his family. Plus, nothing was taken, no money withdrawn, no bags packed, no evidence of preparation. Another theory? Accident. They could have wandered too far, gotten lost, or fallen somewhere unreachable. But that too raises problems. Two people, gone without trace? Even in rough terrain, people leave signs. Nature leaves receipts. But there was nothing. Not a broken branch, not a footprint, not a hat caught on a bush. So then came the third theory, foul play. Could someone have come across them in the canyon, picked them up under false pretenses? Was there a third party involved, someone who had reason, opportunity, maybe even motive to erase them both? And if so, why? Why these two? And why has no one come forward in nearly 40 years? David's family, much like Lloyd's, was left with an unfillable void. Not just the absence of a loved one, but the absence of logic. His disappearance didn't feel like an isolated event. It felt like something that had been scrubbed, deliberately, clinically, like someone had decided these two lives no longer needed to be accounted for, and then made sure that decision stuck. Over the years, tips have surfaced, most dead ends. A woman once claimed to have seen two people matching their descriptions hitchhiking outside of Park City. Another tip placed them near Wendover. Others said they were seen at a rest stop, or in a convenience store, or riding in the back of a pickup truck. Every story had just enough detail to sound possible, and just enough vagueness to collapse on contact. The police reopened the case several times, reviewed old files, re-interviewed witnesses. Nothing changed. David Matthew Jaramillo remains missing. A 1-year-old man who disappeared without warning, in the middle of a day that didn't seem dangerous, under circumstances that have aged into folklore. In another timeline, he'd be 61 years old now. A man with stories, grandkids, worries about retirement. But in this timeline, he is still 21, frozen, filed, forgotten by most. The mystery of East Canyon is now a double silhouette, two faces where there should have been answers. And the quiet doesn't stop there. Because nearly a decade before Lloyd and David disappeared, another man, older, quieter, and just as unassuming walked into the Salt Lake air and never returned. His name was Joseph Santi. And like the others, his story is missing everything, except the vanishing. Joseph Santi. The 22nd of January, 1977. Another winter morning in Salt Lake City. The streets were quiet, brittle with cold, and dusted with the kind of snow that doesn't fall but simply appears, as if the city exhaled and forgot to take it back. It was a Saturday, a weekend, a day built for errands or radio static or simply staying indoors. That morning, 8-year-old Joseph Santi stepped out into the air and then vanished. Joseph wasn't a man known for mystery. He wasn't famous. He wasn't wealthy. He didn't live a double life. He worked. He paid bills. He moved through the world like most people do, predictably. He was reliable. That was the word used most often by those who knew him. Reliable. quiet, present. He left his home that morning for what should have been an ordinary outing. Some reports suggest he may have been heading downtown. Others say he had planned to visit a friend or run an errand, but no one knows for sure. What's certain is that by the end of that day, no one had heard from him. No one had seen him. And by the end of that weekend, it was clear something was wrong. At first, it didn't register as an emergency. Joseph wasn't the kind of person who disappeared often or ever, but he was an adult. Adults are allowed to come and go. Maybe he'd taken an impromptu trip. Maybe he decided to get out of town. Maybe he needed air. But those theories collapsed fast. He didn't take anything with him. Not clothes, not cash, not medication. His car was left behind. So were his keys. So was everything, really, except Joseph. His family contacted the police. A missing persons report was filed. But in 1977, the machinery for these types of investigations was slow, especially for adult men. There were no smartphones to ping, no credit card trails to follow, no surveillance footage to rewind. If a man walked into a street and didn't come back, all you had were doorbells and telephones and guesswork. And in Joseph's case, the guesswork didn't get very far. He wasn't in debt, he wasn't in trouble, he wasn't known to wander, and there was no indication that he was planning to change his life in any dramatic way. He lived modestly. He was close with his siblings. He had a routine and kept it. If anything, Joseph was the kind of man who'd notice if someone else went missing, not the kind you'd expect to become the headline. But there never was a headline. Not really. The investigation, such as it was, turned up little. A few neighbors remembered seeing him leave that morning. One thought he might have had a brief conversation with someone near his apartment building, but no one could describe that person. Another said they'd seen him walking north, toward downtown, but couldn't say when or why. The leads were soft, half memories, blurry recollections offered after the fact. There was no physical evidence, no crime scene, no reason. Eventually, as is often the case, the file stopped growing. Detectives moved on. His family didn't. Of course they never do, but the world around them kept changing. And the space Joseph used to occupy his chair at the table, his place in the family photographs, stayed empty. In the years that followed, his name became more of a memory than a mystery. No one came forward, no remains were discovered, no letters or confessions or secondhand tips, just silence. But not all silence is passive. There are certain disappearances that feel like echoes, others feel like doors. Joseph's case feels like a curtain, something that was pulled shut, on purpose, by someone who didn't want what was behind it to be seen. There are those who believe he may have been the victim of foul play, something personal, intentional, and calculated. The kind of disappearance that doesn't leave a mess because it was never meant to. But without evidence. That's just a suspicion, a lingering discomfort. Other theories suggest he may have experienced a medical episode, confusion, disorientation, collapse. But that too offers no explanation for the complete lack of trace. Even in the 1972nd, people didn't just fall off the grid without some ripple. Yet Joseph left none, which makes him one of Utah's earliest adult vanishings to defy classification. He wasn't young enough to be dismissed as a runaway. He wasn't involved in crime. He didn't match any pattern. He was the outlier, the unexplainable anomaly in a state that still hadn't fully developed a vocabulary for cases like this. And maybe that's why he was forgotten by everyone except those who couldn't afford to forget. His name still sits in the state's Department of Public Safety Missing Persons database. His age is now hypothetical. His file is still open, though no one checks it regularly. It's not that people stopped caring, it's that there was never anything to care about beyond the absence. No trail, no ending, no certainty. And that blank space, as we've seen before, tends to attract others. Because just over 2 decades later, another man, different life, different age, same city, would vanish just as thoroughly, this time at the dawn of the millennium. His name was Kenneth Batchelor, and like Joseph Santee, he left no reason behind. Kenneth Batchelor. On the 31st of January, 2000, Kenneth Batchelor stopped answering his phone. He stopped responding to friends. He stopped existing, at least in the ways the world knows how to measure. At 33 years old, Kenneth was a quiet man with a simple life rooted in Salt Lake City. He wasn't known to stir the pot. He wasn't reckless, dramatic, or particularly adventurous. He worked, he went home, he kept to himself. His life had its share of friction, sure whose doesn't, but nothing extreme. No known enemies, no major upheavals. No reason, at least on the surface, to suddenly disappear from it entirely. That Monday began like any other. There were no distressed phone calls, no notes, no signs of a planned departure. His apartment was left undisturbed, the lights off, mail collected, everything in place, except for him. When his family realized they hadn't heard from him in a few days, the unease kicked in. Kenneth wasn't someone who just went silent. He didn't ghost people. He was dependable, predictable, boring, even by his own admission. So when he didn't show up for work and didn't answer calls, it didn't feel like space. It felt like absence. The Salt Lake City Police Department filed him as a missing person. Officers visited his apartment, spoke to neighbors, checked nearby hospitals and shelters, but there were no leads. No unusual withdrawals from his bank account. No travel records. His vehicle was located, parked exactly where it should have been. Locked, undisturbed. Inside his apartment, the normal trappings of a person who intended to return. Laundry mid-cycle, groceries not yet expired, a stack of bills still unopened, nothing out of place except the man himself. That's when it got unsettling. Because most disappearances, even the chilling ones, leave something behind. A thread to pull, a trail to follow. Kenneth left nothing, not a single indication of where he went or why. No suspicious calls before his disappearance, no strange behavior leading up to it, no big purchases, no confessions, just a vanishing. It wasn't long before the silence turned permanent. His friends and family posted flyers, held out hope. But Kenneth wasn't the kind of man who sparked media frenzies. He didn't have a high-profile career. He wasn't tied to a bigger story. He didn't go missing in a dramatic fashion. So his case remained mostly under the radar, quietly logged in databases, reviewed occasionally by cold case officers, forgotten by almost everyone else. There are theories, of course, there always are. Some say he may have suffered a mental health episode, that perhaps something snapped quietly, unnoticed, a private unraveling that drove him into the wilderness or towards self-erasure. But there's no known history to support that. Nothing in his medical records, nothing in his behavior. Others wonder if he may have been targeted. But for what? He wasn't involved in criminal activity. He had no debt worth disappearing over, no enemies to speak of. If foul play occurred, it came without a hint of motive, or perhaps too cleanly to detect. And then there's the third theory, the one no one likes to say out loud, that he simply chose to vanish. But even that doesn't quite hold. Because if Kenneth had wanted to disappear, he didn't prepare. He didn't withdraw money. He didn't sell belongings. He didn't leave a note. Disappearances by choice often have fingerprints, digital or otherwise. Kenneth's disappearance was too abrupt, too seamless, too void of preparation. In short, it wasn't a man walking away. It was a man vanishing in the space between routines. The calendar rolled forward, as it always does. Years passed. His name receded from active memory. Eventually, even the few flyers left in coffee shop windows and bus stops curled at the corners and fell. His case remained technically open, but in practice, It joined the silent crowd, Utah's expanding archive of people who left without explanation. His family never stopped wondering, never stopped asking what they could have missed, what they could have done differently. But there was no closure to be found. No tip that pointed to something final. Only a name, a face, a record of disappearance so sterile it barely even sounds like a mystery until you remember the most important fact. Men like Kenneth don't just leave. But he did. And in a city that has spent decades quietly accumulating ghosts, Kenneth Batchelor became just another invisible thread in the fabric. Someone you wouldn't notice missing until you noticed that nothing made sense anymore. And he wouldn't be the last. Because 5 years earlier, in that same city, on an equally uneventful day, another young man, this time just 22, left his life behind without a warning or a goodbye. His name was Toby Jesperson. And his story runs cold the moment it begins. Toby Jesperson. On the 10th of August, 1995, a quiet summer Thursday in Salt Lake City, Toby Jesperson disappeared into a life that had only just begun to take shape. He was 22 years old, right at that strange and fragile edge between youthful recklessness and adult responsibility, a place where you still haven't figured everything out, but you're expected to start pretending you have. Toby was last seen in Salt Lake City. No fanfare, no drama, just a day like any other, and then nothing. He didn't leave a note, didn't pack a bag, didn't give anyone cause for concern in the days leading up to it, and perhaps that's what makes his case so difficult. There was no known build-up, no crescendo, just a blank space where a story used to be. His family and friends were blindsided. Toby was social. He had a sense of humor people remembered. He was the kind of person you could count on to show up, to laugh at the wrong time, to offer to help you move without expecting pizza in return. But under that was a complexity people couldn't always read, a kind of quiet depth that, in retrospect, people now pick over with forensic urgency. Was he troubled? Was he trying to say something no one heard? He wasn't known to disappear. This wasn't a pattern. There was no history of running off, no criminal record, no shady associations. He wasn't in debt. He wasn't ducking responsibility. He didn't have enemies, and there was no sign of any mental health episode before his disappearance, though, in fairness, 1995 wasn't a time when people talked about that sort of thing openly. Police took the case, but as is often the story, not much could be done. There were no witnesses, no surveillance footage, no phone trail to follow. A young man in a city leaves his daily orbit and doesn't return. If you can't find the exit wound, you can't call it a crime. Flyers went up. Tips trickled in. Most were dead ends. A sighting in Provo, a rumor in Ogden. Someone swore they saw him on a Greyhound bus, but no confirmation, no body. No evidence of foul play or of voluntary flight. Just the same empty circle that these stories tend to spiral into. Toby's family has lived in that circle ever since. His name still sits in the Utah Department of Public Safety's missing person records. His photo, Forever 22, still gets circulated every few years when people revisit unsolved disappearances in the state. But his case remains dormant. Not closed, not solved, just paused. And here's the thing about stories like Toby's. They're not the ones that get turned into documentaries. There's no signature twist, no suspect with a scar and a motive, no sinister subplot to feed the public's appetite for spectacle. Just a regular guy who stopped being seen and a trail that never got warm enough to follow. The absence is almost too clean, which is, in itself, suspicious. Because people don't disappear without friction. Not really. Not unless someone or something makes sure they don't leave a mess. And in Salt Lake City, 1995, there were already too many people vanishing quietly for it to feel like coincidence. Toby Jesperson was supposed to grow older. He was supposed to come back from wherever he went that day, but he didn't. And the longer his name stays on that list, the more it becomes a symbol not just of loss, but of the limits of certainty. And he wasn't the only one. Less than a decade later, another man in Salt Lake would vanish under eerily similar circumstances. Another ordinary day, another life interrupted with no trace left behind. His name was Jeffrey O'Carroll, I.M. Dollars. And his silence came just as suddenly. Jeffrey O'Carroll. The 30th of March, 2004. A Tuesday. Salt Lake City was shedding its winter skin. The kind of day where the air smells like melted snow and thawed concrete. People were out in it shopping, commuting, making promises they'd forget by June. Jeffrey O'Carroll was among them. A 5-year-old man with a low profile and a life that, like so many others in this city, ran smooth on the surface. And then he was gone. He was last seen that afternoon, somewhere in Salt Lake. The details are vague, bordering on unsatisfying. There's no confirmed location, no last phone call, no witness whose story has withstood time. He just stopped appearing, didn't show up for work, didn't answer his phone, didn't come home. Jeffrey wasn't a man prone to dramatics. He wasn't living recklessly. He didn't have a known history of mental health crises or substance issues. He wasn't fleeing anything, and he wasn't planning to vanish. People who vanish by choice tend to leave trails money pulled from an ATM, a bus ticket, a friend confided in. Jeffrey left none. The police were notified. His apartment was checked, his usual haunts. His bank account sat untouched. His vehicle, like his phone and his keys, was exactly where it should have been. But Jeffrey was not. There's something deeply unsettling about how little there is in his case. A 5-year-old man, vanishing from a city in the 21st century, should leave a digital footprint. But there's no evidence he boarded a bus or bought a ticket, or even left the neighborhood. No surveillance footage has ever surfaced. No suspicious activity. No tips with weight. The story has no shape. It's a chalk outline of a mystery with nothing inside it. Friends described him as grounded. Private, but not secretive. He had a normal routine. Was close to his family. Didn't miss appointments. The kind of person you'd assume would never make this kind of list, but he did. Some think he might have chosen to disappear. Others think something happened. Something quick, clean, final. A targeted act that left no evidence. But why? Why Jeffrey? There's no clear motive, no known enemies, no indication that he was involved in anything that could spark danger. His life wasn't dramatic enough to predict a twist like this. Which is exactly the point. Because Utah has a way of losing people who shouldn't be lost. People who live ordinary lives until they simply don't anymore. Jeffrey O'Carroll is still missing, still officially open, still unresolved. And his name, like so many others, floats just below the surface of public consciousness. A quiet, constant whisper in the files of a department with too many ghosts and not enough answers. But the river of names keeps flowing. Just 6 weeks after Jeffrey disappeared, another man, John Lowen CA's per F, followed him into silence. Different person, same outcome. John Lowen Casper. May 18, 2004. A Tuesday again. That familiar weekday where things are supposed to be in their place. John Lowen Casper was 54 years old when he was last seen in Salt Lake City. Older than the other names on the list, but just as much a question mark. He was someone with roots in the area. Someone who didn't travel often, didn't stir things up, didn't get into trouble, and then nothing. No one saw where he went. No camera caught him. No letter was found. One day, he was part of the city's pattern, and the next, he was a gap in it. His disappearance had all the usual ingredients. No known health crisis, no financial motive, no trace of criminal entanglement. He wasn't running from something. He wasn't lost. And yet he still disappeared completely. His case was investigated, briefly, quietly, then shelved. There are no confirmed sightings, no reliable leads, no big developments to point toward, just a name in a file and a family who never stopped asking, never stopped circling the date on the calendar every year. John Casper didn't vanish because of a bad decision. He vanished because Utah has a strange tendency to erase people while they're still in motion. And like those before him, his story ends not with a conclusion, but with a question that still hasn't been answered. Stephen L. Hughes. The 17th of September, 1986 was supposed to be a regular Wednesday, the kind of workday that began early, ended late, and didn't make headlines. Stephen L. Hughes, 46 years old, showed up at his job in Bountiful, Utah, just like he always did. He parked his truck, settled into his tasks, went about the rhythm of the day, and then, at some point, he stopped being part of it. His truck was found in the parking lot, locked, undisturbed, as if he'd simply walked away for a moment and never came back. No sign of struggle, no mess, no sudden disruption. It was as though he'd evaporated between sentences. Stephen wasn't a man likely to leave without explanation. He was described by those who knew him as calm, methodical, and dependable. He worked hard. He wasn't prone to grand gestures or spontaneous decisions. He didn't live recklessly. He had a quiet presence, the kind of man you rely on to remember your birthday but never tell anyone else he did. The initial assumption was that he'd taken a walk, maybe gotten lost, or had a medical emergency. But when a search of the nearby area yielded nothing, no witnesses, no clues, no trail to follow, that theory fell apart. Police investigated. They asked coworkers, family, friends. No one had seen or heard anything unusual that day. No one noticed Stephen leave. No one saw him afterward. It was as if he'd walked into a fold in the map and simply never walked out. No items were missing from his workplace. His home showed no signs of being prepared for travel. He didn't leave a message, didn't pack a bag, didn't withdraw cash. Everything in his life was intact, except for him. The worst part? His family didn't even know where to start. There were no enemies, no arguments, no crises, just questions that multiplied with time. Could someone have lured him away? Possibly. But why? There was no motive. Could he have wandered off, dazed or disoriented? Maybe. But where's the evidence? If it was foul play, why leave everything else so clean? The geography didn't help. Bountiful, though not remote, is bordered by foothills and canyons, with enough terrain to bury 100 secrets without leaving footprints. And 1986 didn't offer the tools we have now. No GPS data, no phone tracking, no camera grids. So Stephen's case joined the others, quietly, respectfully, into the pile of Utah's unsolved. His family waited. The police checked tips. A few psychics weighed in, as they often do in cases that stall, but nothing ever surfaced. His name faded from the news. His story became less a case and more a whisper, something people mention with a shrug and a sigh. What makes Stephen's case especially unsettling is how ordinary his day began. It wasn't a road trip. It wasn't a night out. It was work. A regular Wednesday at a regular job. And he never left the parking lot. How does a man vanish from his workplace in the middle of the day without anyone seeing? That question still lingers. And while it did, the years marched on. 13 years later, another person in Utah, this time a woman, would disappear under similarly strange, silent circumstances. Just like Stephen, she was supposed to be home by dinner. She never was. Her name was Ruth Jimenez. Ruth Jimenez. The 1st of July, 1999. Sandy, Utah. Ruth Jimenez, 27 years old, vanished under circumstances that everyone immediately described as suspicious, though few could articulate exactly why. She was last seen leaving her home, or possibly preparing to go out, but what happened next has never been fully clarified. No calls, no texts, no video footage, just a life paused mid-frame. Ruth wasn't the kind of person who went missing. She had a tight-knit family, a strong sense of obligation, and was deeply involved in her local community. She was also cautious, trusted only a small circle, had plans for the future, and no history of instability. She simply vanished. Her apartment showed no signs of forced entry. Her personal belongings were untouched. Her car was left behind, her bank accounts dormant. Nothing about her disappearance suggested she had left willingly, and everything about it raised suspicion. The police took her case seriously early on. Interviews were conducted, backgrounds checked. No clear suspect emerged. There were no known stalkers, no disputes with partners, no angry coworkers, no suspicious acquaintances, at least, not officially. But the absence of evidence was itself suspicious. The way she vanished felt too clean, too coordinated, as if someone knew how to erase not just a person, but the questions that followed them. Tips came in, as they always do. A sighting at a gas station, a woman matching her description spotted in another state, a vague report from someone who said they overheard something at a party. But nothing stuck. Her family refused to let her name fade. They organized vigils, contacted media, appealed to the public. But as weeks turned into months, and months turned into years, her case cooled. Not because it was solved, but because it refused to heat up. Ruth's story highlights the particular cruelty of disappearances that defy narrative. There was no event to point to, no known enemy, no obvious mistake. She was just a woman living her life, and then she wasn't. Eventually, her case landed where so many others do. A file marked missing, with no footnotes and no answers. And Utah quietly moved on. But just when the state was starting to forget Ruth's name, another person disappeared. A man this time, older, seemingly unrelated. But the silence? Identical. Mark Johnston. The 11th of October, 2016. Mark Johnston, 43 years old, clocked out of work in Sandy, Utah, and left. That's all anyone really knows. That's where his story stops having witnesses. Mark was a creature of habit. He kept a schedule, he showed up on time, he worked in logistics, which meant he knew how to keep track of things. So, when he didn't show up the next day or the day after, it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like something had interrupted him. The day after he left work, there was one final piece of movement, bank activity, a small transaction. But after that, the record goes blank. His car was never found, his phone was silent, his accounts untouched, no texts, no calls, no social media activity. He didn't pick up his paycheck. He didn't tell anyone he was going anywhere. It was like someone pressed pause and never hit play again. Police tried to track his last known whereabouts. Security footage showed him leaving work, but not what happened next. He was supposed to stop by a store, maybe get food, maybe head home. But he did none of those things. No one knows if he ever made it out of the parking lot. His family searched everywhere, filed every report, checked shelters, hospitals, jail logs. Nothing. He didn't fit the profile of someone trying to vanish. He wasn't struggling with addiction. He wasn't in debt. He wasn't spiraling. He was just living until he wasn't. As time passed, theories multiplied. A robbery gone wrong? A targeted attack? A random event that left no evidence? But all of them fell flat under the weight of one impossible fact. Not a single clue has surfaced. Not one. Mark Johnston remains missing. A father, a worker, a man with plans for the weekend, gone in a city that pretends things like this don't happen here. But they do. And Utah keeps the tally, quietly, patiently, one vanishing at a time. Kenneth Starbuck. By the time Kenneth Starbuck went missing in 2016, the language around disappearances had changed. Salt Lake City wasn't the same city it had been in the 82nd or 92nd. It had apps for everything, camera feeds on every corner, a digital paper trail for even the most mundane moments, which is what made Kenneth's vanishing feel like an echo from an earlier, more forgetful Utah, something that should have been impossible in the modern era. Kenneth was 54 years old, a resident of Syracuse, Utah. He'd survived a lot in life, more than most people even knew. A traumatic brain injury had left him with lingering neurological complications, including a seizure disorder and memory lapses. But despite those challenges, he was functioning, he was stable, he was cared for. His family was involved. There were systems in place to support him. And yet, in 2016, he disappeared. The details are thin, even by the standards of missing persons cases. He was last seen near his residence. It's not clear what his destination was, or even if he had one. He didn't leave a note. He didn't pack a bag. No money was taken. No calls were made. He just walked out of the frame. There's a particular kind of panic that accompanies disappearances involving people with cognitive or neurological conditions. It's not just the fear of foul play. It's the fear that the person is disoriented, vulnerable, perhaps unaware that they're even missing, that they may be walking in circles somewhere, trying to remember what street they live on, or worse, that someone with bad intentions noticed before anyone else did. Search efforts were immediate. Police, family, volunteers all scoured the area. Flyers went up across Davis County. Local news stations picked up the story, especially after word spread that Kenneth was likely without his seizure medication. There was a real, urgent danger, and still no trace. Not a sighting, not a footprint, not a single camera in a city full of them caught a clear image of Kenneth leaving, walking, wandering. No convenience store cameras, no bank activity, no cell phone pings. The absence was so absolute it felt cinematic, except real life isn't supposed to vanish on cue. Over the years, tips have trickled in. Someone thought they saw him in Ogden. Someone else swore they saw him on a bus to Nevada. Another caller believed he was living among the unhoused population in Salt Lake City, blending into the background of the city's forgotten corners. But every lead went nowhere. Each possible sighting dissolved under scrutiny. Kenneth Starbuck remains missing. And it's the kind of missing that breaks people slowly, not in a sudden tragedy, but in the slow erosion of unanswered questions. For his family, every day is a repetition of the same quiet horror. Imagining him alive, but lost. Imagining him confused, out there, not knowing how to ask for help. Or worse, imagining that someone saw him in that vulnerable state and chose the wrong kind of attention. He was never found, and the case remains open, still listed on the Utah Department of Public Safety's missing persons database. His name is one of many on that growing ledger. A man with a life, with a diagnosis, with people who cared, and still, he slipped through the cracks of a society that prides itself on surveillance and systems. Some absences scream. Kenneth's only whispers. And the city moves on. But the silence didn't stop there. In fact, it was followed almost rhythmically by another vanishing. This time, someone older. Someone believed to be alive, but living in the in-between spaces most people ignore. Curtis Crosby. Curtis Crosby was last seen in 2014 in South Salt Lake. He was in his 62nd at the time, and, by all accounts, adrift. Not in the poetic sense, more in the bureaucratic one. The kind of person whose last known address was a temporary shelter. The kind of man who might exist on the edge of a dozen systems, but not fully inside any of them. He may have been disoriented. He may have been mentally unwell. He may have been simply exhausted with the mechanics of surviving. The point is, Curtis was vulnerable, and then he vanished. There is no last known photo, no time-stamped footage, no confirmed destination. Curtis's disappearance didn't make the news. There were no front-page appeals. His name was added to the state's missing persons list almost like a formality, and that's how it felt like paperwork, not panic, which is the cruelest part. Because Curtis wasn't nobody. He was someone. A man with a history, with memories, with people who probably still ask about him quietly, awkwardly, at family gatherings, after checking to make sure no one's listening too closely. The prevailing theory is that Curtis may still be alive, that he may be moving among Utah's unhoused population, that he may have chosen consciously or not to disconnect. In some circles, that's seen as an answer. But it isn't, not really, because a person isn't found just because you think they're somewhere. He is still listed as missing. His file hasn't been closed, but neither has it been actively pursued, as far as anyone can tell. And the longer he's gone, the more his absence blends into a broader conversation about mental health, about housing, about how society quietly loses people it doesn't know how to help. Curtis didn't leave a clean hole behind. He left a fog, a dull ache, a whisper that says, sometimes people fade, and the world lets them. And Utah, a place known for structure, family, and community, is also a place with corners dark enough to forget someone like him. But Curtis wasn't the last. Just 2 years before his disappearance, another person, this time a woman with a distinctive tattoo and an entire life's worth of baggage, walked out of sight. And she hasn't been seen since. Rebecca Jane White. It was sometime in the summer of 2012 when Rebecca Jane White vanished from South Salt Lake. No one remembers the exact day. It wasn't marked with an argument or a confrontation or even a specific destination. It was just another day. And then it wasn't. Rebecca was 34 years old. She had a complicated life, one marked by struggle, survival, and movement. She was known in the local community. Not famous, not infamous, just known. To shelters, to social workers, to people who lived close to the margins. Her ankle bore a distinctive chain-link tattoo. It was the kind of detail that would help in an identification. If she was ever found. But she hasn't been. There is little public information about the circumstances of her disappearance. No confirmed witnesses, no known suspects, no events that can be pointed to as the moment it all changed. Just the increasing silence that came when she stopped being seen. Friends stopped hearing from her. Staff at local aid centers realized she hadn't come around, and eventually, someone reported it. But by the time the case was filed, Rebecca had already become a memory. Some believe she met with foul play. Others say she may have left the state, that she could be out there, still living, just under a different name or in a different city. But there is no evidence for any of those theories. No sightings, no phone activity, no paper trail, just a tattoo, a name, and an empty space. What's hardest about Rebecca's story is how typical it is. How her disappearance doesn't stand out in a state where this kind of silence has started to feel expected. Women like her, poor, vulnerable, moving through fractured systems, go missing often, and their cases rarely get the attention they deserve. But Rebecca wasn't a statistic. She was a person, and someone, somewhere, still remembers the sound of her laugh, the way she walked, the meaning behind that ankle tattoo. Someone, somewhere, still wonders if they missed a sign. And the mystery doesn't rest, because it never got solved. It never even got close. She vanished, like Curtis, like Kenneth, like so many others. And the list goes on. Michael Marsh. Tooele City isn't the kind of place that attracts national attention. It sits west of Salt Lake, tucked into Utah's empty spaces, where the skyline is more mountain than man-made and the nights fall quiet without asking permission. It's a town that prides itself on simplicity. But in February of 2006, something disappeared from its structure and no one has been able to put it back. Michael Marsh, 40 years old, was last seen on the 21st of February, 2006. One day he was there, part of the landscape. The next, he was gone. Michael wasn't a celebrity or a criminal. He didn't live loudly. He was a working-class man, the kind who did his job, kept to himself, and didn't cause much trouble. He had no known enemies, no serious disputes, no legal entanglements. His life was modest and mostly invisible to anyone outside of his circle, and then it stopped showing up altogether. There was no sign of a struggle, no obvious reason for his disappearance. His personal belongings were left behind, his vehicle too. His bank accounts were untouched. There wasn't even a confirmed destination for his last known movements. He didn't say he was going anywhere. He didn't act like someone who was planning to vanish. Tooele police opened a missing persons case, but in a small city like that, resources were limited. A 40-year-old man who left without any evidence of foul play? That's a hard case to work, even with a full team. And Michael's case didn't generate much attention. No press blitz, no candlelight vigils, no long-form articles dissecting every moment. Just a name quietly added to a database and then left to sit. His family didn't accept that. They pushed. They made noise. They printed flyers, contacted news outlets, revisited old haunts. But Tooele isn't built for high-profile searches. It's built for endurance. And when a man disappears without a scene, that silence becomes part of the town's rhythm. There are theories, of course. Some suspect foul play, maybe an argument that turned into something worse, something covered up before it could leave a mess. Others wonder if Michael wandered off in a state of confusion or distress, perhaps due to an undiagnosed condition or a mental health event. But those are just ideas. There's no evidence to support them. And the clock keeps ticking. The problem with cases like Michael's is that they offer nothing to hold on to. No timeline, no last sighting, no piece of information you can build a theory around. Just absence. And absence doesn't age well. It doesn't attract tips or updates. It just settles, thick and unmoving, like Tooele's winter fog. Michael Marsh remains missing. His name is still listed. His face, a middle-aged portrait that never got the chance to grow older, resurfaces occasionally on Utah's cold case lists. But his story hasn't moved forward in nearly 2 decades. And in the space he left behind, only questions remain. The same kind of questions that started circling just 4 years later, when another Utah resident, this time a young man in Layton, walked away from home and never came back. Ayub Pugh. In 2010, Ayub Pugh walked out of his family's home in Layton, Utah, and vanished. That sentence is simple. The mystery isn't. Ayub was in his mid-22nd. Smart, quiet, thoughtful. He wasn't in trouble. He wasn't in crisis. He wasn't spiraling. By all accounts, he was grounded. He came from a supportive family, had strong values, no known conflicts, no criminal record, no debts, no relationship turmoil, just an ordinary life in a quiet Utah suburb. And then one day, for reasons no one has been able to explain, he left. No message, no bags, no phone calls, no goodbye. His family initially thought he might come back the same day. Maybe he needed space. Maybe he was going for a walk. But as hours turned into days, then weeks, the weight of uncertainty started to build. They filed a missing persons report, contacted police, checked hospitals, shelters, jails, nothing. There were no sightings, no withdrawals, no evidence of travel. He didn't buy a ticket, didn't borrow a car, didn't text a friend for a ride. He simply walked away from his life and left it fully intact. Law enforcement struggled to build a case around what didn't exist. There was no obvious motive, no digital breadcrumbs, no indication of a plan. And while some cases generate suspicion or outrage or even fear, Ayub's created only confusion. What would make a young man leave everything behind without so much as a single clue? One theory suggests he may have left voluntarily, gone off-grid to seek some kind of reset. But those close to him reject that. He wasn't the type to do something so drastic without telling anyone. He valued structure, family, peace. Another theory? A mental health episode. Something unexpected. uncharacteristic. A break that fractured his sense of reality just long enough to disorient him. But again, there was no history of that. No warning signs. And then, of course, there's the third possibility, the one no one wants to name out loud, that someone saw an opportunity, that something happened on his walk, that someone took him from that ordinary moment and removed him with precision. But there is no evidence of that either. The trail is clean, too clean, the kind of clean that doesn't occur naturally. Ayub Pugh is still missing. His name is still in the system. His family still searches, still hopes, still wonders. But hope, stretched over more than a decade, becomes something quieter, something harder to explain. And in Utah, it's become a familiar sound. Because missing doesn't mean gone, and gone doesn't always mean dead. Sometimes, gone just means unanswered. And those unanswered questions never rest. Just ask the family of Mary Kay Miller, who disappeared 30 years earlier and whose case still haunts the gaps in Utah County. Mary Kay Miller. In 1979, Mary Kay Miller went missing from Utah County. She was 38 years old, mature, grounded, responsible. She had a life, a routine, a presence in her community. She wasn't lost. She wasn't isolated. She had people who cared about her and a future she expected to keep living. And then she was gone. There's almost nothing on record about the day she vanished. No last phone call, no confirmed sighting, no timeline to reconstruct. All that remains is the date, 1979. And the fact that Mary never came home. The records on her case are sparse. A few scattered notes, a basic description. No known suspects, no official theory, no confirmed foul play. She just stopped being part of the world in a moment that left no visible mark. That kind of vanishing doesn't happen easily. And yet, in Mary's case, it did. Her name is still listed by the Utah Department of Public Safety. Her photo, when available, shows a poised, kind-looking woman, eyes steady, hair neat, expression composed. She doesn't look like someone you expect to see on a missing persons database. But that's the problem with expectation. It doesn't matter. Mary's case is one of the oldest on Utah's books, one of its quietest, one of its most persistent mysteries. And like so many who came after her, she left behind nothing but silence. Guy Michael Johnston. In 1981, the quiet hills of Brigham City, Utah, swallowed a young man whole. Guy Michael Johnston was 20 years old when he vanished, but his name has barely made it past the edges of his hometown. It's not because his story is less important. It's because it happened the way a tree falls in the woods without an audience, without a witness, and with no one certain which direction the sound went. He lived in Brigham City, a small town by almost every definition. Life there moves slow, days run together, and people don't disappear unless they want to. But Guy didn't seem like someone trying to escape. He wasn't in trouble. He wasn't a mystery wrapped in contradictions. He was, by most accounts, a good kid. His friends said he was easygoing. His family described him as dependable. He had dreams like anyone his age, but none that involved disappearing from the map. There's no publicly available police narrative on Guy's last known movements, no detailed timeline, no clear statement about whether he left home voluntarily or whether he was expected back. That absence of detail has only compounded the mystery over the years. What is known is that at some point in 1981, Guy stopped answering calls, stopped showing up, stopped being part of his own life. And nothing ever surfaced to explain it. No sighting, no credit card use, no accidental clue, no remains, not even a rumor worth writing down. Just a blank space in a town that never really acknowledged how strange it was for someone to vanish without cause. Was it foul play? There's no evidence. Did he leave on purpose? His family doubts it. Could it have been an accident? That, too, raises more questions than it answers. Guy Michael Johnston is still officially listed as missing. He would be over 60 now, perhaps with gray hair, maybe grandchildren, maybe a house in the hills with a garden out back. Or maybe he never made it past that day in 1981. Maybe something happened, something that no one saw, something that left no mess, but also no possibility of return. And like so many before and after him, his name became a data point, a small line in a long file. A reminder that even in small towns, where everyone knows your name, you can still be forgotten, especially if you vanish too cleanly to leave a story behind. Guy's silence still echoes. And it would not be the last. 12 years later, just a few miles down the road, another young woman would disappear under similarly baffling circumstances. Her name was Sarah Norfleet. Sarah Norfleet. It was 1,993 inch, Bountiful, Utah. A place not often associated with headlines or high-profile cases. A suburb, a sanctuary, a city that quietly boasts stability and routine. But for 3-year-old woman, the illusion of safety unraveled completely. Sarah Norfleet disappeared sometime that year. The details are scarce, foggy, and frustrating. There's no hard timestamp, no known sequence of events. Just the year, the town, and the silence that followed. Sarah wasn't a high-risk individual. She wasn't in trouble with the law. She had no documented conflicts or crises. By every measure, she lived a life that should have kept her anchored to the ground. But even the most grounded people can be lifted out of frame when no one's looking. She was last seen in Bountiful. How, where, and by whom isn't publicly known. And from that moment forward, everything stops. No bank activity, no phone records, no sightings. Her name didn't dominate the news. There were no statewide search parties. She didn't vanish dramatically, she simply stopped showing up. There's no information on whether her car was found. No note, no eyewitness, nothing you can hang a theory on. That's what makes her story so difficult. Because it's hard to solve something that never even defines its own shape. And in a city like Bountiful, silence becomes strategy. The community moved on. The case faded. And Sarah's name became one of those quiet entries in the Department of Public Safety's long list of unresolved disappearances. Her family never stopped asking questions, never stopped calling. But in the years before the internet could carry a name like wildfire, cases like Sarah's were easy to misplace, easy to ignore. There was no viral campaign, no digital sleuth army, just paper records, unanswered phones, and the sound of grief quietly aging into resignation. If she were alive today, she'd be in her 50s. Maybe working a job she liked. Maybe married. Maybe sitting on a porch swing somewhere, telling someone about the life she lived. But there are no signs that she got to live it. The questions still remain. Why did she disappear? Where did she go? Did someone take her? Did someone silence her? Or was it something even harder to explain? Sarah Norfleet is still missing. And her case, like so many others from the same era, would soon be eclipsed by an even stranger disappearance, one that involved a child. A name that would be whispered across Utah's valleys for years to come. The name was Susan Curtis. Susan Curtis. The 27th of June, 1975, the last day of a summer girlhood that never got to become anything else. Susan Curtis was 15 years old when she vanished from the Brigham Young University campus in Provo, Utah. She was attending a youth conference, something countless teenagers do every summer in buildings that buzz with fluorescent lights and hopeful conversations. She was supposed to head back to her dorm room after a brief break between activities, but she never arrived. No one saw her leave. No one saw her taken. She simply stepped out of the frame and into a mystery that would never fully unravel. Susan was smart, driven, full of energy. She wanted to become something, maybe a teacher, maybe a writer. Her family adored her. She was known for her quick wit, her kindness, and her determination. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't troubled. She was 15, and she was there one moment, gone the next. Despite the suddenness, her case drew attention quickly. Campus security was alerted. Police got involved, but the search turned up nothing. No eyewitnesses, no belongings, no scream, no trace. It was as if the campus itself had chosen to forget her in real time. But then, years later, theories began to emerge. One name in particular hovered around the case like smoke: Ted Bundy. Bundy had been active in Utah during that exact time period. His known victim list overlapped with Susan's age, location, and disappearance. And eventually, he reportedly confessed to killing her. According to some sources, he claimed to have buried her body near Price, Utah. But even that never offered closure. Because despite the confession, Susan's body was never found. No physical evidence confirmed his account. No location was verified. Her remains were never recovered. The confession became just another ghost story, plausible, persuasive, but ultimately unverifiable. Susan Curtis remains officially missing. Her photo, young, full of life, is still shared in missing person databases. Her name still circulates in true crime communities, but she remains a name with no grave, a story with no ending. And even if she was taken by one of America's most infamous predators, her story deserves more than a name in a list. It deserves a reckoning. Because Susan's disappearance reminds us that even the most high-profile mysteries can remain unsolved, that even when the villain has a name, the answers don't always follow. She should have gone home that summer. She should have grown up. She should have been allowed to live. Instead, she became a permanent part of Utah's shadows. And so did the girl who vanished the year before her from the very same corner of the state, in what would become one of Utah's oldest and most painful mysteries. Her name was Nancy Wilcox, and she was just 16. Nancy Wilcox. On the 1st of October, 1974, Nancy Wilcox left her holiday home to go get a pack of gum. She never came back. She was 16 years old, bright, funny, responsible, a cheerleader at Olympus High School, someone who had places to be, plans to keep, and an entire future that had already begun to take shape. Her neighborhood was safe, her routine was normal, and her disappearance made no sense. The last confirmed sighting of Nancy was near her home in Holiday, a quiet suburb just south of Salt Lake City. She was driving her yellow Volkswagen Bug. She was seen by multiple people that evening. And then she was gone. Her car was later found not far from where she'd last been seen, abandoned, but not damaged. No signs of a struggle, no trace of her, no note, no reason. Just an eerie stillness where a girl used to be. It didn't take long for police and family to realize something was wrong. Nancy wasn't the kind of teenager to run away without telling anyone. She was dependable, socially active, grounded. She had no reason to vanish, and yet no one could explain where she'd gone. As the days passed, her case gained traction. Flyers went up, the media took notice, volunteers combed the area, but it all led nowhere. Then, years later, the shadow of her case darkened in a way no one could have expected. Ted Bundy, already convicted, already infamous, was rumored to be involved, and eventually, he would reportedly confess to her murder. According to statements made by Bundy in conversations with law enforcement, Nancy had been one of his early victims in Utah. He claimed he took her to a secluded area and that she was never seen again. But like many of Bundy's so-called confessions, the details didn't always hold up. The location he claimed to have left her remains Big Cottonwood Canyon, was searched multiple times over the years, but no body was ever found. No physical evidence ever confirmed his version of events. And without that evidence, the confession, while chilling, remained incomplete. To this day, Nancy Wilcox is still officially listed as a missing person. Her remains have never been recovered. Her family, despite decades of heartbreak, has never been able to lay her to rest. Her story is tangled in the larger narrative of one of America's most notorious serial killers. But for those who knew her, Nancy was never a statistic, or a case file, or a piece of true crime trivia. She was a sister, a daughter, a teenager with favorite songs and inside jokes, and a life that was stolen before she even knew how much of it she had left. Nancy's name doesn't fade. It lingers, especially for those in Utah who still remember the fall of 1974, not as a season, but as the beginning of something unspoken, a season where girls began to go missing, and explanations never followed. But Nancy wasn't the first person to vanish in Utah's wilderness of silence. 40 years earlier, another young life would go missing under even stranger, lonelier circumstances. Everett Ruiz. If Utah has a patron saint of vanishing, it's Everett Ruiz. He was 20 years old in 1934, an artist, a writer, a wanderer, and something of a legend even before he disappeared. He left behind letters, woodblock prints, poems. He had walked thousands of miles through California, Arizona, and Utah, alone, on foot, or by mule. He sought wild places and avoided cities. He wasn't escaping anything. He was searching for something. He had no interest in being found. But when he was lost completely. In November of 1934, Everett Ruiz left Escalante, Utah, heading into the canyons of the Navajo wilderness. He was well prepared, experienced, comfortable with isolation. He had done this kind of thing before. He wrote letters home describing his plans, and then he vanished. His last letter, dated the 11th of November, 1934, ended with an eerie flourish. As to when I revisit civilization, it will not be soon. I shall not return. That might have sounded poetic at the time. Afterward, it felt like prophecy. When he failed to return as expected, a search began. His 2 burros were found tied to a tree in Davis Gulch. Some of his belongings were nearby, a campsite, a few supplies, but no Everett. No signs of a struggle, no body. The theories that followed became folklore. Some believed he had fallen into a crevice or drowned in the Escalante River. Others speculated that he had been murdered, possibly by cattle rustlers or even by someone he'd encountered in the wilderness. Still, others suggested Everett had faked his own death, vanished intentionally, and started a new life elsewhere under a different name. All that remained were his words, his journals, his artwork carved into rock walls and sold by collectors years later. The myth grew stronger than the man. In 2009, a tantalizing lead emerged: human remains discovered near Combe Ridge, along with a pack bearing the initials ER. A DNA test seemed to suggest it might be Everett. National Geographic ran with it. For a brief moment, it seemed like one of Utah's oldest mysteries might finally have a resolution. But the confirmation didn't hold. Later, DNA testing ruled out the match. The bones belonged to someone else. And Everett Ruiz became a ghost once more. He has been gone now for over 90 years, and yet his name still stirs something in the American imagination. He's become the symbol of vanishing, the desert's chosen mystery. The artist who walked into the sandstone canyons and never came back. What happened to him? We still don't know. And maybe, for Everett, that was the point. But for the families of the missing, the ones who didn't choose to disappear, the point is the opposite. They want closure. They want answers. Like the family of the next person on Utah's list. A boy this time. Only 12 years old. And lost in the vast, breathing wildness of the Uinta Mountains. Garrett Bardsley. The 20th of August, 2004, was supposed to be about fishing. Garrett Bardsley was with his Boy Scout troop on a camping trip near Cuberant Lake in the Uinta Mountains. It was cold that morning, cold enough that when Garrett got his shoes wet, he returned to camp to change into dry socks and sneakers. He told his father he'd be right back. He never returned. It should have been a simple walk, maybe 200 yards from the edge of the lake to the tent. A matter of minutes, flat terrain, well-trodden paths, the kind of space where you can see between the trees. Not a place where a child disappears. But Garrett did. When his father realized he wasn't coming back, panic set in quickly. The entire camp began searching within minutes. Rangers were notified. Authorities arrived. The search effort swelled to more than 1,400 volunteers, helicopters, dogs, professional search and rescue teams. The area was combed over and over again. Nothing. Not a shoe, not a sock, not a shirt, not a footprint. Just a cold mountain morning, a wet pair of shoes left behind in a tent, and a trail that vanished after 200 yards. The theory at the time was that Garrett may have gotten turned around and wandered off, that he became disoriented and veered off into denser forest. But the search radius was enormous. Every possible route was covered multiple times. Some believe he may have fallen into one of the many small bodies of water that dot the area, or into a crevice too small to detect. Others fear that he may have been taken not by nature, but by a person. There were other hikers in the area. It's possible, however unthinkable, that someone saw an opportunity. But there was never any evidence to support either theory. And so, like those who vanished before him, Garrett's case faded into the long, cruel silence that defines so many of Utah's disappearances. He was 12 years old, and he never made it back to the tent.